Good day and welcome to Cheryl's Kitchen. Just as a warning, I don't want you to think this is a cooking show or a baking show. Some of the content you may hear or see on here may be disturbing to some, so listener or viewer caution is advised. So what's Cheryl's Kitchen about? It's a show about what is interesting, at least to me, at any given time. If you like it, say so. If you don't, say so, and suggestions for future episodes are welcome. So let's go on. What interests me this week is pandemics. We're at the tail end of one right now, so it's topical. I'm not a doctor. I'm not even in the medical field. So my explanations won't be terribly technical. Let's take a few steps back in history to the 1300s in Europe and Asia. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, absolutely gutted the population. It's estimated between 75 and 200 million people died of the Black Death, representing about 60% of the population of that particular area at that time. So what caused it? Well, the short answer is fleas. Fleas that were infected with the bacteria that caused it. So some things I'd like to consider when we look into these things further is the first is how contagious these things are. And the plague is highly contagious. Fleas with the bacteria transmit it to people who transmit it to other people. Vulnerability. Everybody at that time was vulnerable to the Black Plague. Social class or wealth was no guarantee that you couldn't be infected. Now, the big thing is about if you had money, you could at least pack up and move somewhere that was somewhat plague-free, but it could catch up to you. Let's talk about hygiene and sanitation. They were basically non-existent in the 1300s. Open sewers were the norm. Disposal of garbage and personal hygiene were not big priorities. And when they actually buried the dead during the Black Plague, they were in shallow graves, and it was very messy. So superstition at that time definitely would have played a part. 1300s peasants were a superstitious bunch, so the plague could have been seen as a retribution from vengeful spirits. While we're on about vengeful spirits, let's talk about the church. The only really stable institution in Europe at that time was the church, and they put their own spin on it. It might have been seen as a sign of the apocalypse, and in a way, it was an apocalypse. Literacy. How many people could read or write in the 1300s? The answer is not too many. Education was primarily conducted by religious organizations. So a lot of the priests could read and write, and they would tell the populace what to do. Medical science was practically non-existent, and often the surgeon and the barber were one and the same person. Hence the Saturday Night Live skit, Medieval Barber. Nutrition could not have been good either. This would go hand in hand with medical research, which there was none. Poor nutrition means you can't fight infections as well because your system is weaker. Communications, and it's not just how we speak to one another. It's the method of communication and lines of communication. It's our way of traveling to other places. So in the 1300s, you walked. If you were wealthy enough, you took a horse or a wagon, or took a cart. If you're on the seas, you're on a ship, and it's by sail. You'd think it would slow the spread, but the plague was virulent, and it spread anyway. So all in all, the Black Plague is a killer, and that's a fact, Jack. And it's still here today. It didn't go anywhere. There are cases reported every year, and you think it's a third world problem, you'd be wrong. Cases have been recorded in the United States. So let's move forward about 600 years to 1918. The year World War I ended, and the next and the onset of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu took 50 million estimated people worldwide. The cause was a virus that caused the immune system to overrespond, thereby killing the persons infected. It was highly contagious, and everyone could have been potentially infected. Vulnerability. Those people in the age range of 20 to 40, healthy people, were the most vulnerable and had the highest death rate. Hygiene and sanitation were far better, but not to the level they are today. Very few places had running water, and outhouses were the norm. There were no flush toilets. Superstitions, I would guess, were probably not a huge issue here, but we all harbor some of our own, knock on wood. The role of church or religion. If I recall correctly, the religious people, the church, at least here in Winnipeg, asked people to refrain from forming big groups and encouraging people to stay home. And you will see in the photos I brought up, they are remarkably similar to the public health orders we had in Manitoba today. Literacy. By now, those in Europe and North America, probably I'm guessing 90 to 95%, could at least read and write, and so as that goes, education improves as well. Medical science by now is far more advanced. World War I and Florence Nightingale had forced medical science to learn how to fight not only gunshot wounds, but infections as well. Nutrition at this time is far better than it was 600 years earlier. I would dare say research by medical science would contribute to this. Let's go on to the big one, communications. We now, in 1918, we have the telegraph, telephone to stay in contact. We have rail and steamships to get us places. The automobile is just starting to make its debut, and in 5 to 10 years from then, the automobile and roads and the highway system will become more common. Air travel isn't far off either, so the faster you can get someplace, the faster you can spread the virus. The Spanish flu is a killer. There's no doubt about that. It's still here in some form because viruses mutate. And we, as a herd, may have developed some immunity to it. So let's add another 100 years to the timeline. We're at the tail end of the COVID pandemic. Thus far, the pandemic has killed 5.4 million people to upwards of 23 million people, depending on who's doing the counting. As before, there are considerations. Now, 5.4 million people, if you're at the low end, 23 million at the high end, there are now 7 billion people in the world. So the percentage, the death rate percentage, is far lower than the previous two I've mentioned. So let's talk about the COVID. We all know it's highly communicable, and especially the Omicron variant, but that is not as deadly as the Delta. Everyone potentially could have been infected, but for whatever reasons may not have been. The elderly and those with comorbidities are the most vulnerable. And this includes the people that are immunocompromised. You know, they have rheumatoid arthritis or celiac disease or something like that. Let's talk about our hygiene and sanitation. This is the best we've ever been as for hygiene and sanitation. And some people, experts, are saying perhaps we're a little too clean and that our immune systems don't get a chance to get worked out to fight infections. Just give me a sec. I got to turn the page here because this is what I do. Let's talk about superstitions. I don't think superstitions play a role here at all, at least not that I'm aware of, at least not in North America. Religion is not a major factor worldwide, but where I live, it is a factor. Certain churches are anti-vax, anti-lockdown, and were encouraging their worshipers to do this. One of the ministers was arrested by the RCMP at one point and charged with several misdemeanors. Literacy. Well, developed nations, most of us can read and write, and advanced education, college, or university is available. Medical science these days is fantastic. People who would have died now live with the advances in medicine, including another epidemic I'll talk about very shortly. Thanks to medical science, our nutrition is fantastic as well. But the downside can be obesity, which is one of the comorbidities that COVID-19 latched onto. We also, due to the preservatives in our food and the processed food and the sugar we ingest, diabetes is becoming an issue. And again, that was one of the comorbidities that COVID latched onto. Communications. Well, we have all of what I've mentioned previously. There's still telegraph offices. We still have landlines. We add air travel, which means I can leave, Winnipeg, Manitoba, feeling fine. And by the time I fly to Toronto, I've become symptomatic and I've passed my COVID on to somebody else. Just an example. We also have the internet, and that's virtually instantaneous. It's a great way to communicate with your friends. It's good to research on. You just have to be mindful of who you're researching and where your sources are. There are downsides. A lot of disinformation has been spread on the net. What we call fake news, I like to call, lies, have perpetuated the internet as well, to the point that governments are wanting to crack down. So, all that being said, here are some things I've learned. Human beings, including medical doctors and scientists, are fallible. They can make mistakes. They are just like us. Virology scientists are pretty rare, and it really does take time to see how a virus behaves, replicates, and mutates. Second thing I've learned is viruses mutate all the time. I've known this for a while, and this novel coronavirus was no different. It mutated to Delta, which was far more deadly. Then it wasn't as contagious. But as Omicron developed and mutated, it was far more contagious but less deadly. Now, I'm sure a virologist could explain this all to you, why it does that. I can't. The internet has truly given a voice to anyone with a means of connection to the net. A lot of half-truths and outright lies are spread on any given day. So be selective on who you pay attention to and where you get your sources. The last thing I'd like to mention before I wrap up is long-term care facilities and their hiring practices need to be addressed by governments. Novel corona is a highly contagious virus, and thanks to corporations whose bottom line was more important than the health and welfare of their residents and their staff, there were needless deaths. So in conclusion, despite the current pandemic that's still making headlines, there's another still here. We've called it an epidemic now. Remember HIV and AIDS? 36 million people died due to HIV and AIDS. Despite that, medical science has developed treatments that combat HIV. The world isn't going to end. The sky is not falling, despite some of the Chicken Littles who told you so. We'll all get back to normal, at least what passes for normal, in the near future. So, here are some thoughts I have for next episodes. I had one in the works called Winter Soldiers, and that will be one of the ones in the future. Mental health and suicide awareness, nuclear, biological, and chemical arms, 1930s criminals gangs, Star Wars, This Is the Way, the USSR, the old Soviet Union, Niet Soviet, and Afghanistan, its recent history from about 1979 to the present day. So thank you for listening or viewing. And if you like this, please click the like button or leave a comment. And let's be careful out there.